We're live streaming here on YouTube and Facebook. Hello, social media. Good evening. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club. We are going to get the music playing and let everybody into the room. I have a great show for you tonight. Thanks for being here. There we go. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. And welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club. This is Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, June 19th. It's great to see you all this evening. My name is Sean Hall. For those of you who I have not had the pleasure of meeting, or you may be new to us, I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. And our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing this for, I think, 17 years now, since 2008. And we're hoping to do it for 17 or 18 more years. So please join us on our website, veteransbreakfastclub.org, to find out more about us, find out all of our past programs. We have hundreds of them now. We've been doing the Zoom programs for the past several years, day in and day out, bringing you great programming. The host tonight, Glenn Flickinger.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces. For those of you who might not know me and are new to the Veterans Breakfast Club, Greatest Generation, I get the great privilege, the honor, the fun of hosting almost every Thursday night program on everything World War II. It's a blast for me, particularly because I get to introduce and get to know people like our guest tonight, Joe Balkoski, who I have been reading his books for decades now. We're going to introduce him in just a minute. But we're going to talk about tonight, and let me pull up this PowerPoint. Everybody knows I'm a PowerPoint crazy, so let me pull this up that prepared with Joe's input a little bit here. Okay. So we did a program a couple of weeks ago on Eisenhower and Eisenhower's role in D-Day, Eisenhower's emergence from lieutenant colonel to supreme commander in a matter of a couple of years. We did it with an author by the name of Michelle Paradis, who wrote the book on Eisenhower called The Light of Battle. And I think everybody tremendously enjoyed that. We talked about some of our D-Day veterans, probably 4 or 5 that we've had on the program in the past. One is still with us, and we'll talk a little bit about him again tonight. But now tonight, we're going to turn the story to what happens after D-Day. It's my own opinion, I think shared by quite a few, that too much of emphasis goes into telling just D-Day, June 6, 1944. And the reality is the Normandy campaign lasts for 6, 7 weeks after D-Day. It's a ferocious campaign with huge sacrifices on the part of the American, the British, and the Canadian forces, as well as some other Allied forces. We don't have the time to tell 100% of that story tonight, but through our guest tonight, Joe Balkoski, we are going to tell the story of at least the 29th Division from June 7th, 1944 through towards August of 1944. So, Joe, please wave your hand and say hello.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to talk about the 29th Division's role post D-Day, and as I was telling Glenn earlier, the 29th was one of 5 American divisions that came into Normandy on D-Day, and of course that number grew incrementally in the next couple of weeks. But the story of the 29th is almost a microcosm of every other division in the Normandy campaign, and they lived and fought and died over a 7 week period that was some of the toughest fighting in American military history. So we can talk about that tonight.
And that's where we'll go. But Joe, first let's start a little bit. Let me take the PowerPoint down for a second. Tell us about you, Joe. Tell us about your background, how long you've been focused on the military history, the Normandy invasion. How did you even get started on this
Well,
subject?
I guess you might say that my appetite for history began as a kid, very young kid during the centennial of the Civil War. And, uh, my long-suffering parents tolerated my wish to see battlefields, and that got me going. But realistically, how I came to Normandy and the 29th Division, because, I actually wrote a 5-volume history of the 29th. The one you see here that we'll talk about tonight was actually my first that I wrote in the 1980s, and there have been 4 since then that take the 29th all the way to VE Day and then home in 1946. So I've lived this subject now for over 40 years, and how I came about it is that as a young man, I moved to Baltimore, Maryland, where I still live, and I was a very fortunate man in my mid-20s to have had many neighbors who I just happened to notice, always remarked that they served on D-Day. And I said, boy, this is unusual. I have so many people who live in my neighborhood who are D-Day veterans. And when you took that exploration one step further, you learned about the history of the 29th Infantry Division, which was and still is a Maryland and Virginia outfit in the National Guard. The 29th of the 5 American divisions that came in on D-Day, it was the only one to have National Guard origins. So it had a core of people from the Mid-Atlantic region, Maryland, Virginia, a lot of Pennsylvanians, but overwhelmingly Marylanders and Virginians. And I just happened to be lucky and met many of these men when they were still young, in their late 50s, early 60s. And what I discovered is that they hadn't really opened up about it to anybody, not to their families, not to their spouses, their kids. And I found out that they were really bursting to talk about it to somebody who could understand. Because when we talk about Normandy tonight, you'll see that the experience of the common soldier in any U.S. Army division or any Allied division for that matter was brutal and very traumatic. And in the post-war years, anybody who was lucky enough to survive really couldn't talk about it very openly unless it was with their wartime buddies who would understand. And I just got lucky. I got lucky. I guess I was a good listener, and I guess I asked the right questions. I was very sympathetic, and I also had the very good fortune of being a historian within the military community, and consequently, I spoke that curious language that's spoken in the army. So when I spoke to them, I could kind of speak their language, and they opened up to me in numbers that, when I look back on today, I can't believe what a lucky man I was. But, save for one 105-year-old man who lives a couple of miles from me right now, who I speak to frequently, he's the only one left.
Only
So
one from
the
D-Day.
only one from the 29th Division. Yeah, 105. Still golfs, still sharp as a tack,
Wow.
but he is the last one. So anyway, that's how I got into it, and essentially these veterans were just really anxious to have their story told. They
And
really couldn't tell it themselves. They just didn't feel comfortable telling it themselves. But they wanted their story told, and they wanted it told in a way that really brought out the reality of the frontline combat. Even though I was kind of brought up as an academic, I do not write these books as an academic. I write them for an audience of soldiers. I mean, I want the men who lived it to completely relate to the story. And I don't want these books to be, college textbooks.
right.
I just, it was a perfect storm for me because not only did I know the men personally, but in my job as a historian, I had access to all of the original documentation and archives and maps and photos. And, I just came to the conclusion as a young man that if I didn't do it, who was going to do it? And so I finished my last book on the 29th Division in 2015. So it took over 30 years to do the whole thing. But today we'll talk about Normandy.
Yeah, yeah. Treasure trove of knowledge. And maybe we could have you back at another time to go further into the European campaign with the
Sure.
29th. Yeah. So
No problem.
one aspect about the 29th I'd like everybody to appreciate, and it's in your book, the Beyond the Beachhead, that I enjoyed tremendously. I'm a big English military history buff too. And when you talk about the English regiments, they go back hundreds of years, the Queen's Own and the King's Own and all that stuff. And I never thought until I read your book about the ancestry, the antecedents of some of our National Guard divisions. And the 29th has a very special one called the Blue Gray Division. And maybe you could explain where that blue gray name comes from.
Well, the nickname of the division, the Blue and Gray Division, only dates to 1917, and that was when the modern U.S. Army, as we know it today, was created for World War I, and that was when we established the concept of divisions. But the components of the division had long histories that date back to the mid 18th century. One of the components of the 29th Division was the 116th Infantry Regiment of Virginia. It was known as the 2nd Virginia. It dates to 1742. And it's one of the oldest, it's still in the Army today. It's one of the 5 oldest regiments in the Army. And my hometown, Baltimore, has the 175th Infantry as another component of the 29th Division, and it dates to 1774. And it's, I believe, the 7th oldest regiment in the U.S. Army today. So, yeah, I mean, and believe me, the men were aware of that, tradition, because being a National Guard outfit, you tend to have men who knew one another in all of these companies. In the 116th Infantry, for example, I just spent the 81st anniversary of D-Day in the beautiful town of Bedford, Virginia. I don't know if any of you have been there, but it's the home of the National D-Day Memorial. And in the interwar period, it was the recruitment town for one company of the 116th Infantry, Company A. And, notoriously, I should say, 19 Bedford young men lost their lives in the first hour of the D-Day invasion on Omaha Beach. So, these men knew one another, they grew up together, they trained together, and, that was part of what made the 29th Division very special.
So one last fact about the 116th, which is one of my favorites, because I too go back to, as a young man, fascinated by the Civil War. And the commander of the 2nd Brigade, which was the antecedent to the 116th Regiment, was
Stonewall Jackson, yes.
Paul Jackson, which is why they're called the Stonewallers.
Yes, they refer to themselves as Stonewallers during World War II. And now I must say, as the war went on, that was somewhat diluted because, as we'll learn tonight, the level of casualties and turnover in some of these infantry companies was so intense that by, 6, 7 months later, there probably was not a single man left from the original National Guard contingent. And Normandy was one of the prime reasons for that. The division lost close to 8,000 men in 2 months, and the division at any given time only had 14,000 men. So that gives you a sense of the turnover. And I want to emphasize that of those 8,000 casualties, and this held in any division, in any theater of war in World War II, something like 90% or a little more of the casualties suffered by a combat division were suffered by the men in rifle companies. They only amounted to about 1/3 of the division in manpower, but they gave 90% casualties. And
So,
that's, yeah.
so if you had a division, which there were, I think, 5 or more divisions in World War II that suffered over 200% casualties as a division, the rifle companies up front were suffering 400%
Oh,
casualties.
more than that. Yeah.
Turnover after turnover after turnover with the replacements. Yeah, yeah.
They used to, somewhat cynically joke in the 29th Division when the Normandy campaign was closing that the division was actually a corps of 3 divisions. It was a division in the field, it was a division in the hospital, and it was a division in the cemetery.
Yeah.
That was a rather ghoulish way of looking at it, but there was certainly a grain of truth in that. Yeah.
Okay. Now that we've kind of started the conversation and know a bit more about you, Joe, and how you came to be so knowledgeable about the 29th Division, let's jump into this. If I can get my power. Is everybody seeing that okay now? We seeing this map?
We can see it. Yeah.
Okay. Just, most of you are familiar with this. This shows the initial few days of the Normandy invasion. You see Utah Beach on the far, at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, Omaha Beach, where the 29th and the 1st Division come ashore in the morning of June 6th. And then, of course, the British, Canadian, and then the other British division with the airborne troops landing on the flanks. Okay. I just want to kind of set this up, okay, a little bit. This is Omaha Beach. I'm sure many of you have been there, seen this. This is actually my own personal picture I took when I was there in 2013, and I'll be there again there in a couple of months with our VBC travel group. I like this picture because it's taken at more or less low tide, and it shows sort of an extreme version of how this beach was crescent shaped with the bluffs up behind it. And Germans, this is about what, Joe, 4.5 miles from one side to the other?
Yeah, 5 miles is really the how they define the frontage of Omaha Beach from end to end.
But you can see why it was such a killing field, right? Where I was standing taking this picture on the one of the far extreme sides, I believe that would be the eastern extreme. There were bunkers behind me with artillery pieces that could fire all the way down this beach. So we don't want to get into a discussion of D-Day itself, but I just think in order to set the foundation. So, Joe, this is where we pick up the story of what happens after D-Day. The 29th Division lands right here, where I'm putting the cursor here. Joe, what was the objective of the division starting on June 7th?
Well, that's a great question, and let me start by describing perhaps a fact that you guys don't know. You've all heard of Operation Overlord, but what you may not know is Operation Overlord was not just the amphibious invasion. Operation Overlord was the plan liberate France and end the war by entering Berlin. As the man who planned Operation Overlord said when he was given the seemingly unachievable mission of accomplishing this in 1943, he said, "I have been asked to accomplish nothing less than the reconquest of Europe." So what we know of as D-Day really officially was known as Operation Neptune. So the object of Operation Neptune was to just establish the beachheads, and from that day forward, we could be here for hours describing the complexity of the Normandy campaign, but objective number one for all the beachheads was to link them together.
Right.
So in the case of the 29th Division, they were to drive west along along the Calvados coast, as it's called, and at the same time relieve the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, where your cursor is right now, and where you see that arrow crossing what's known as the Veer River estuary, right there. The 29th was to link up with the Utah beachhead in the 101st Airborne Division, and that was a very significant mission, because the Utah invasion front was only added to the invasion plan in January of 1944, and the reason it was added was that the Calvados coast, where the 29th landed, had no natural harbors. So the logistical support of the armies was clearly going to be difficult. As Winston Churchill famously said, however, there are no ports on that sector of Normandy, on the Normandy invasion front, so we will have to bring our own. And that another story is that we'll talk about in the future are the Mulberry Harbors. But the Utah beach component of the plan was thrown in January for the paramount goal of capturing the port of Cherbourg, which is up there where you're showing the cursor right now. So the only problem with that plan was that, as you can tell, Utah sits off by itself. So it was a very significant part of the 29th Division's post-invasion plan to link up as quickly as possible so that the front of Utah and Omaha would be continuous. And that was accomplished by about June 9th, June 10th or so. Not particularly hard fighting yet. There's a little village there that I visited many times called Isigny. It's a little to the east of Carentan. Carentan was where the 101st Airborne was coming down from the north, and Isigny right there is where the 29th Division was coming from the east.
Right.
Now, simultaneously with this, and I should point out that part of this Overlord plan for the liberation of Europe consisted of what they called phase lines, and that was the expectation of where the Allies would be on certain dates post-invasion. And as you might imagine, and no doubt as you've read about, these phase lines were wildly optimistic. As you probably know, the British expected, according to these phase lines, to capture Caen on day one. It ended up not being captured until mid-July. St. Lo, if you can point out St. Lo, there it is. St. Lo was an objective in like the D+4, D+5 range. It didn't end up being captured until July 18th. Cherbourg was something like a D+10 objective, and it wasn't captured until the very end of June. So these phase lines were kind of a problem. The expectation of the plan and what was happening in reality were very, very different. And I want to tell you a little story about the 29th Division's training period in England that was very significant They were visited in their training grounds by all the top commanders. Eisenhower visited, of course. Bradley came and talked to every assault company, but even Bernard Montgomery, who was nominally Omar Bradley's commanding officer at this time. They didn't separate an American Army group out until the end of July. So Monty was really the chief ground commander at this time. But anyway, he would come to the 29th Division training grounds, and he would give the same speech to every assault company. He said, I want you men to know that once you drive inland from the beaches, it's extremely important that you drive inland as fast as you can go. And almost verbatim, I'm going to quote him here. He said, "You are not to worry about your flanks." He said, "That's my responsibility. The Germans are going to be disorganized, and you have to push inland as quickly as you can." So, and that's where we're up to right now, Glenn. With the linking up of the beachheads and the 4th Division and 2 other divisions driving on Cherbourg, the mission of the 29th now shifted to moving inland as quickly as possible. And I'm sorry, do you have a question, Glenn?
Well, no, just what they find when they get to the top of the bluffs and start moving inland is these kind of problems, right? Which we're looking at this picture.
Exactly. So one thing that if you have to name one thing other than the Germans that was the primary impediment to fulfilling the achievement of these so-called phase lines was the terrain of Normandy. For those of you who haven't been to Normandy, I'm sure you've heard of the expression hedgerow country. In Normandy, it's called the Bocage, Bocage, and it is a name. Yeah, that's roughly the extent of the Bocage country, and it's kind of unique. It exists a little bit in Brittany, but other than Brittany and Normandy, there's nothing like it in the world. And people in America. And I suppose one could speculate during the training period in England, they said, well, hedgerows, what's the big deal? But it's far different than that. These, if you look at a picture of Normandy from the air, it's a crazy quilt pattern of enclosed fields that might look like they're just surrounded by shrubbery. But in reality, when you see them up close, it's actually earthen embankments anywhere from 4 feet to, as high as 8 feet high, sometimes maybe even a little higher than that, extremely thick. Like if you had one person, there's a good picture of a tank shoving its way through a hedgerow. You cannot imagine this type of terrain anywhere in America. And when the GIs were introduced to this, it was a bit of a shock. It shouldn't have been a shock, but we can discuss that later. The bottom line is that it enhanced the Germans' ability to defend by an absolutely significant factor. A single machine gun team of 2 men doing what the Germans always did, is opening up from a corner of a hedgerow field and then shifting to another position, opening up from that position, and then going to a third position, could bring to a halt 200 Americans. And the overcoming of that single machine gun could often take all day, if at all. And typically the German would just escape one field to the rear, and the whole process was repeated again. You're looking at an example of how the Americans ultimately would deal with this problem with the so-called these Rhino tanks with these kind of plows at the front of the tank. But interestingly enough, the 29th Division had invented their own
Oh,
solution for this problem. Their engineer colonel, who I was very lucky enough to have known, Robert Ploger, he was only about 24 years old, but he commanded an entire battalion at the age of 24 of 800 men. He came up with putting these two what looked like almost jousting poles on that were welded to the front of the tank. And the object was to ram the tank into a hedgerow and then back out and put explosive charges into the holes caused by those poles, and then detonate it, and then you'd have a gap through the hedgerow. Now that did not come till much later. That didn't come until mid-July, so another 5-6 weeks after Normandy. But the fighting that ensued, between June 7th and, let's say, the July 11th, which was when the 29th Division finally got its act together and made a set-piece offensive toward St. Lo. It was a period of about 5 weeks. It was hell on earth. The men were not used to the bocage.
Joe, if I could ask you just to hold a moment.
Sure.
I play this whenever I get the chance because this is our own Warren Goss, who's 100 years old, from Pittsburgh. That's him today and him back in 1944. He landed at Utah Beach in a combat engineer battalion, and he was a rifleman to protect the combat engineers. So at Utah Beach, he was one of the first handful of men on the beach. And he's still alive. He went with us to New Orleans a couple months ago. And there's this famous film, which I think many of our members have seen, but I'm going to play it again. And it's only a few seconds. Play it again so you can. So that's Warren Goss in the foreground.
Oh, wow.
That's Warren Goss jumping over that hedgerow and crawling out. And I asked Warren 2 questions when I was with him in New Orleans. Warren, how'd you know that was you? He goes, I didn't, but my mom did. When my sister and mom went to the movies a few months after D-Day, and they played the newsreels. They played that newsreel, and Warren's mom jumped up and said, "That's my son." So you watch any documentary on Normandy, and that little clip is in it. The other question I asked Warren was, you had that hand grenade in your hand. How many did you throw that day? And this was a few days after D-Day. He goes, I don't know, but I threw as many as they possibly gave me. So, yeah, we have an actual veteran here that we all know quite well. He doesn't come online very often, but he's at a lot of our events. So I'm sorry, Joe, I interrupted you to show that.
No, that was well worth hearing. So, in my books, I discuss the issue of any unit acclimating to this type of brutal combat. And again, it's a bit of a microcosm to any combat division in any theater of World War II. This was the 29th Division's first combat. Unlike its landing partner on Omaha Beach, the 1st Infantry Division, which had made 2 amphibious invasions before D-Day. So the 2 divisions made a very interesting pair, let's put it that way. The 29ers were, eager to go. They'd been training for 3.5 years for their moment in the sun, and they had a very aggressive division commander, who I'll talk about in a second. They had a division motto, 29, let's go, which they chanted all the time. And during the training period in England, the 1st Infantry Division people would be incredulous when they'd watch these, 29 soldiers who'd never seen a bullet fired, chanting and marching in step, and supposedly on one of the training maneuvers, one of the first division soldiers yelled out, "Go ahead, 29, we'll be right behind you," they said. It was, and it only took a couple of days to become a veteran in this type of combat, if you were lucky enough to survive that couple of days. But in my book, I pull no punches. The U.S. Army had a bit of a leadership problem. And it's understandable that they would have this leadership problem, because in the space of 2 or 3 years, the Army multiplied, 50-fold.
Yeah.
And you had people rising at command rank from, maybe commanding an infantry company of 200 men to commanding a division of 14,000 men. I mean, as a microcosm, of course, Dwight D. Eisenhower, in the space of 2 years, rose from lieutenant colonel, who had never commanded a unit, a combat unit. He was an executive officer for a very short time of an infantry regiment and did not fight overseas in World War I. He rose in under 2 years from lieutenant colonel to 4-star general, which is really incredible. But it didn't work out in many cases as well as it worked out for Ike.
Well, isn't it true that particularly in the 116th, as I remember, which was mostly from Virginia, Bedford, Roanoke, Stoughton, the officer corps that was leading those National Guard armories, almost that whole officer corps at the sort of major colonel level turned over, and
Pretty much.
yeah, because they tended to be the vice president of the local bank, or and they were older. They were 40 plus years old at 1940 when they were nationalized. So they had to remake the whole division in effect, or at least large parts of the division.
George Marshall was the driving force behind that. He wanted young men in command of combat units, and you'll see the contrast. If you look at the photographs of division commanders in World War I, you see men in their 60s with white mustaches.
Yeah.
But if you look at division commanders in World War II, you'll see men in their 40s or early 50s. Now, that being said, as I said, there was a leadership problem. We had a man commanding the 29th Division named Charles Gerhardt, who, like everybody else, he'd been a lieutenant colonel just a couple of years in the past, and here he is commanding 14,000 men in the most significant military operation of American history. And I want you to know that when you do meticulous research, you see some things that are alarming, and I didn't hesitate to put these in the book, but during the training period in England, Omar Bradley, it was very clear, did not like Charles Gerhardt. And in several meetings with Eisenhower, he said, "We got to find a new commander for the 29th Division." And the only thing I can speculate is that Eisenhower saved Gerhardt because they were teammates on the West Point football team for 1 year before Ike injured his knee. And Ike always, and by the way, Gerhardt was the star quarterback of the West Point football team and led West Point to a famous victory over Knute Rockne's Notre Dame, I think in 1916. Anyway, Gerhardt was a superstar. But as to whether he could command men, it was another question. And it was at all levels of command. Two of the 3 regimental commanders of the division were gone within a week.
Yeah.
Their replacements didn't do much better. The division had to acclimate to this type of fighting, as every unit had to do. And it took about 6 weeks before they really had down how they were going to defeat the Germans in this horrible bocage country. And their objective, which was, as I said, was a D-Day +4 objective, the town of St. Lo,
Right.
uh, held out until July 18th.
Right. Let
Now,
me
man, I'm sorry, go on, Glenn.
Yeah, let me show this map of the objective, because this is a large part of the story of the attack on St. Lo, with the 29th Division for the most part coming down this Martinville Ridge, right? So I've not been to St. Lo and the country around it. I've read the books. Tell us about the topography of this area in here that they were fighting through for so many weeks to get to St. Lo.
Well, in addition to the very severe bocage nature of the country, that is the sunken roads and the 8 foot high hedges and the earthen embankments, the further south you go into Normandy from the coast, the more you start to get uneven terrain in terms of undulations and hills. It becomes really pronounced when you get south of St. Lo and you get into almost semi-mountainous country. But the ground northeast of St. Lo that you can see on this map, it's called Martinville Ridge. And that was where the 116th Infantry made a decisive breakthrough of the German lines that you can see on July 11th. They, by practicing what they called one squad, one tank, one field tactics. And one tank with those jousting poles on the front of them and pole charges put in the hedgerows, bust through the hedgerow, send the tank through the hedgerow, infantry behind, artillery barraging 100 yards ahead. It really worked. And the person who you probably have heard of, if not, I'll explain who he was, who really was responsible for this maturation process in the 29th Division that really made the division into one of the top divisions in the whole ETO, was a fellow by the name of Norman Coda.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
was the assistant division commander of the 29th Division. And if you've seen The Longest Day film, you know that he was played in that movie by Robert Mitchum.
Famously played by Robert Mitchum, cigar smoking,
Right.
chomping, badass general. Uh, except in the movie, they portray him nicely, but his actual actions are D-Day were very different than what they portrayed in the movie, which I've explained to many people many times.
He said that he couldn't watch the movie; it was so unrealistic. But I feel that it actually did a decent job in introducing the complexities of what happened. Now, how it portrayed Coda on Omaha Beach. He said that it wasn't anything like that. He said, but
Right.
Coda was a 51-year-old
Yeah.
who, beyond doubt, and I'm not a person to use superlatives. Beyond doubt, deserves the Medal of Honor for his heroism on Omaha Beach. He saved hundreds of lives.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
he very famously said to somebody who said, General, you're risking your life here. And he said, well, it's better that a 51-year-old man dies than a 20-year-old kid.
Yeah.
And he was that type of man. And, he fully documented, was a one-star general, but would actively participate in frontline actions by hurling grenades into windows of houses, jumping into the driver's hatch of a Sherman tank, and he always said that if the men see that an old guy like me can do it, they know that they can do it.
Yeah.
And he was responsible pretty much in entirely for that July 11th successful attack.
He leads this column down this road into St. Lo, does he not?
Actually, no. What happened is that 116th column was stopped right there at the eastern outskirts of St. Lo. And one of the most famous 29ers in all my 5-volume history, a fellow by the name of Tom Howie, whose daughter I'm very friendly with now, from Stanton, Virginia. He was ordered to push on into St. Lo and by General Gerhardt, and he, depending on who you talk to, he either radioed back, he said, "See you in St. Lo," or "Will do." And 5 seconds later was killed by a mortar shell. And we'll talk about what happened with him later. So the attack then shifted up to the 115th Infantry. Yeah, there's the 115th Infantry entering St. Lo.
Yeah.
Of all of those buildings, only the one in the background still stands. And interestingly enough, right at the base of that house today is a very nice statue of Tom Howie, who's there. It is. Yeah. He's called the Major of St. Lo because he was, and General Gerhardt went to an aide, and he said to him on July 18th, he said, "Where's Tom Howie?" And his aide said, "Sir, you know he's dead." And he said, "God damn it, I know he's dead. I want you to take his body, put it on a stretcher, cover it with an American flag, take it by jeep into St. Lo, and put it on the rubble of the St. Croix Church, which is what you see in the background, so that when our men pass into the city, they will see the man who gave his life for us to enter this city." And that spot, other than the rubble, is hardly changed today.
This is what was left of St. Lo after the battle. Not much.
St. Lo in France after World War II was called the capital of ruins. And, it wasn't so much the battle that did this to the city. It was the D-Day and pre-D-Day bombing by the 8th Air Force that did this to the city. If we go back to the map, Glenn, I'll give you the reason why St. Lo was important. St. Lo was a road junction. I'm not sure this shows every road, but 8 roads come together at St. Lo. And therefore the Germans, really needed this for logistical purposes. Getting, either their horse-drawn vehicles or motor vehicles to bring supplies up to the front.
Yeah.
But St. Lo was the prerequisite for the famous operation that would lead to the Normandy breakout called Operation Cobra.
Right.
General Bradley said that with St. Lo in German hands, he couldn't launch Operation Cobra. Operation Cobra was a little off to the left of this map.
Yeah.
And it started on July 25th, exactly a week after the liberation of St. Lo.
Joe,
Yeah, there's the map showing the breakout. Now you
Joe,
see St. Lo is right on the right there.
excuse me, Joe, I'm going to ask you to pause. We've been going about 45 minutes now, and
Sure.
I know there's been a very active chat going on in the background, and I have seen a couple of hands raised. So if you don't mind, Joe, I'd like to stop for a few minutes and invite questions
I
from
love it.
the audience. Or Sean, was there anything asked in the chat that we should address?
If anybody would like to go ahead, if you want to digitally raise your hand and shake your hand, let me pop over to the different view here. It's very lively. Excellent chat tonight, everybody. Thank you. Who had a question? I know I saw a hand earlier, but then it popped down again. Maybe the question was answered. And Colin, great. Thank you so much for all the pics and information. And I see Scott Masters here as well. Thanks for being here. No
So,
waving? Go
Anybody,
ahead.
anybody like to take advantage of one of the foremost historians of the Battle of Normandy? I keep firing away questions, but I want to make sure the audience has a chance to ask theirs.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
One comment in the chat, which I always like to focus on, comes from several, but I think it was David Sever.
Seaver, yeah.
Beaver mentioned the logistics involved in supplying these frontline combat troops. I don't know, I don't want to catch you by surprise, Joe, but obviously that's true. How difficult was it to get all of the ammunition, the food, the water, the medical supplies to these men off of Omaha Beach when Cherbourg was still in ruins?
It was a tremendous problem, and that is also one of the pivotal reasons why the first month of combat for any division in Normandy, including the 29th, was so difficult. There were ammunition shortages like crazy, and ammunition shortages would hurt the American army all the way through November.
Yeah.
They just, with the tremendous firepower that the American army had, it was very difficult to get enough shells, particularly artillery shells, to the frontline units. As you know, as I mentioned earlier, there was no natural port on the Calvados coast of Normandy, and the Mulberry harbors, mixed results. The American one didn't work very well. The British one worked much better. Even with the American one not working, we were able to, offload across the beaches fairly effectively, but not at the rate that that was needed for the blossoming manpower that the Americans were bringing ashore into Normandy. And you mentioned Cherbourg, Glenn. Cherbourg fell at the end of June, but the Germans, as you might expect, were masters of making everything difficult, and they destroyed that harbor so effectively that it really wasn't until, I would guess, first week of August that they started really taking ships in there, and that's 2 months after D-Day.
Yeah. Yeah.
So every unit, aside from riflemen who always had sufficient rifle ammunition, mortars, howitzers, and long-range cannon had severe ammunition shortages right up until the middle of July. And there was a storm,
Yeah.
a very severe English Channel storm on June 18th/19th that wrecked the American Mulberry Harbor, and it ceased the offloading of supplies for like 3 days. And that really, really put a crimp in things.
And the great other irony about that storm and that date is had Eisenhower delayed the invasion after June 6th, the next date was July 18th, 19th as a possibility. So imagine, many people have said if there was ever a chance that the invasion of Normandy was going to fail, it was probably going to be because of the weather, right? You can go
That's true.
back in history of the English Channel and find hundreds of examples of invasions, one way or the other, that failed because of the weather.
I often turn that argument around, Glenn, because the target date for D-Day, you may know, was not June. It was May. It was May 1st of 1944.
Right.
And it was understood for 8 or 9 months that May 1st was going to be the target date. It was only when Ike and Monty came into England from the Mediterranean in January, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Utah Beach and Sword Beach were added to the invasion plan to add to the original 3 invasion beaches, that Ike said, well, with this new enhanced amphibious assault, we're going to have to delay from May to June.
Yeah.
And, that has now been accepted as necessary. But the problem is that you lost all that good campaigning weather in May, which, knowing European weather, when November hits in Europe, it's very hard to carry on military operations. It's very difficult.
What's the
So
famous Churchill quote, Joe, as he fretted about the start of D-Day? Something like, the fate of the world is hanging on some damn thing called LSTs.
Right,
They
right.
didn't have enough of them.
Well, that was the primary reason why D-Day was delayed by 1 month.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, unless there's other questions, we're going to go forward with the story with Joe.
There is a question here. Today, the Army looks for at least a 3-to-1 manpower ratio of offense to defense advantage to advance. What was the overall ratio in Normandy and in front of the 29th Division?
Well, that has been an accepted ratio for a long time, but the reality of Normandy was that primarily because of the bocage, 3-to-1 was not nearly sufficient. I mean, I'm speaking in general terms. It's hard to, you know, throw around numbers like that, but put it this way. I reiterate what I said. A single German machine gun team of 2 or 3 people could hold off an entire American rifle company for an entire day. So, it wasn't just the bocage. The Germans were absolute masters of defensive warfare, and their weaponry, as I go into in an entire chapter of my Beyond the Beachhead book, their weaponry, as a rule, was far superior to our weaponry. Now, everyone says the M1 Garand was a wonderful weapon, and it was. As Patton said, it was the greatest battle implement ever devised. But the Germans didn't go for that theory. They said rifles are insignificant. What is significant is machine guns at the very lowest level of an infantry squad. And every infantry squad of 8 men had the deadliest machine gun in the world. And that made a huge, huge difference in Normandy that the Americans really had a hard time overcoming.
That being the MG-42.
The MG-42, known as Hitler's buzzsaw.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was a fantastic weapon. It was miles ahead of American machine guns.
Yeah.
And light enough to be carried by one guy and to switch positions. Every time they opened up, they would move to another position, and it just drove the Americans crazy.
And didn't have the ability to change barrels was very easy and quick, which is what also made it so.
The German machine gunner had a glove, and if he fired one belt of ammunition, he really could use almost a continuous fire. He just snapped that glove onto the barrel, snapped it off, and you'd have a new barrel in 10 seconds.
Yeah.
And they carried like 2 or 3 extra barrels.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else, Sean? Can we head back to the story? Try to be finished by midnight.
One more from Jeff. Joe, could you speak to a term used in Normandy today, for example, in the museums, describing Normandy by the end of the Battle of Normandy as a necropolis? How many Americans lost their lives in the 8 weeks of the battle? How many Allied soldiers, German soldiers, and last but certainly not least, how many French civilians lost their lives?
Well, I don't know those numbers. I believe American deaths were in the 20 to 25,000 range. French civilian deaths were mostly before D-Day because of the bombing of rail yards and logistical centers. I mean, St. Lo, as I said, was bombed before D-Day, and it was turned into a pile of ruins. And it's one of the most amazing things when you go to Normandy today and you visit these towns like St. Lo, and in which Americans are venerated. I mean, when I used to go over with 29th Division veterans, I'm not exaggerating, they were rock stars.
Yeah.
And even now that we don't have really any veterans going back really, just any American going back for the purpose of studying what happened there in World War II is a bit of an admired person. And as I always remark, it's kind of awkward because we destroyed these towns, and yet every single French person says that it was the price of liberation.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And it's very, very touching to see that. St. Lo is You know, there's almost nothing left from the pre-war city. It's all modern construction, but you know, when you know how the battle evolved, it's still very, you can really see some sites that are very evocative.
So one of the things, Joe, I can't remember if it's in one of your books I read or something else I read, but speaks to the savagery of the battle for Normandy and the topography and the hedgerows and so forth, is that uh, bodies were being found, corpses were being found for 2 or 3 decades after the end of the Battle of Normandy. Uh, I think the last German body was found in the 80s. Do I have that right? Is
Oh, they're still there. I mean, there are bodies that have not been found that no doubt are still in Normandy. To give you an example, on June 13th, 1944, a single rifle company from the 29th Division, Company G of the 175th Infantry, crossed the Veer River, and it was an ill-conceived mission, and they unfortunately bounced into the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. It was one of the only times in World War II that the 29th Division fought an SS unit. And of this company, maybe 160 men crossed the river. They were captured almost in their entirety. And the Germans, it was an SS unit. They went through the dog tags and they found 2 Baltimore soldiers with H on their dog tags, which they knew meant H for Hebrew.
Yeah.
And they singled these 2 men out, and they were never seen again. Whereas the rest of the company was taken off to a prisoner of war camp. Um, they were executed, and the army, I forget the name of the organization that is DPAA, I think it's called. They're centered in Hawaii, but they
Oh,
go
yeah.
worldwide looking for the remains of American soldiers, and they sent a team to look for these 2 bodies around the village of La Rae, which I have been to many times, and I drew a map of where I thought these 2 men would have been taken. And they brought over the team brought over dogs that were supposed to sniff for human remains, and they were never found. So they're there somewhere, and someday they will be found. So, and it's not an exception. There are going to be, you know, there are still 29th Division soldiers all over Europe that have never been found.
Sobering, very sobering.
Yeah.
Okay, let's march on, or else we won't get to kind of 2 or 3 more. So the Operation Cobra and the breakout. Joe, speak to that, please.
Well, the breakout was carried out by the American 7th Corps, of which the 29th Division was not a part. The 29th Division finally got a break. And as you can see, for the first time in the Normandy campaign, the American Army had learned the lessons that had to be used to defeat the German enemy. And the breakout was extensive. It was supported by a major strategic bombing effort that frankly didn't do any good, and ended up, you know, having a significant amount of fratricide. But and you know, almost every time in World War II that strategic bombers were used in a tactical role like this, it didn't work out well. But suffice it to say that July 25th is when it begins, and by August 1st,
All right. Yep.
something happens that's very significant. August 1st is when they snatch General Bradley's First Army from Montgomery's control, and they bump Bradley up to the 12th Army Group, and he is now equal to Monty in command level, and they create the Third Army under Patton. So Patton comes into play on August 1st. So, you know, a lot of people credit Patton with the breakout, but he wasn't even in command of his army until August 1st. He starts making headlines in the first week of Normandy when he really does an end run around the Germans and rushes into both Brittany to the west, where incidentally the 29th Division would be sucked. That would be off map, and also heads toward Paris in the east and tries to ultimately encircle the German army, as you can see from that map. So that map shows Brittany, which is that giant peninsula pointing out to the west. The Germans had occupied the port of Brest, which is the second largest harbor in France, and it was a totally pivotal part of the Overlord plan. Under the phase lines that I mentioned, we were supposed to control Brest by early August and bring in U.S. troops subsequently, as we did in Brest in World War I. So that's where the 29th Division went and ended up fighting a brutal battle at Brest for 3 or more weeks, losing 3,500 men to capture that port with 2 other U.S. divisions. And simultaneously, as you can see from this map, Patton did this famous end run for which he will always be famous, and started to close up on the Germans in what became known as the Falaise Pocket, where you see the cursor now. Now, the 29th Division was involved in this campaign in early August, before they were sent off to Brittany. They were tasked with another St. Lo type mission. They were tasked with capturing the city of Vire, V-I-R-E. And it was part of, Vire, there's Vire. Again, another city that was obliterated by American bombers because it was used as a German communication center. And Vire was ended up being captured by the division on August 6th, exactly 2 months after D-Day. And as an aside, I should say that when we used to go to Normandy with all the vets, Vire was always one of our favorite stops, because when 29th Division veterans marched down the main street of Vire, when they came back, it was almost as if it was like equal to a VJ Day parade or something. The French locals just went completely crazy and showered everything on these 29th Division veterans. And as you can see, the irony of their town being completely obliterated and thanking their American liberators.
Yeah.
So Vire was part of that closing of the pocket. And as the pocket became more and more and more constricted in mid-August, the 29th Division was pinched out, sent to Brittany, as I said, along with the 2nd Division and the 8th Division. And then ultimately, there's a lot of controversy still today about why a truly decisive victory was not won at Falaise by completely encircling the Germans. It was, of course, a very major victory for the Allies, but a very significant number of Germans escaped. And the pursuit across France was somewhat slowed by closing the Falaise Gap. And it would come back to haunt us later. But, in the euphoria of the victory, I was about to bring this up. Eisenhower very famously toured that one single road that was the German escape route from the Falaise Gap. And he famously remarked that you really couldn't walk on the road without either stepping, you'd have to step over bodies or walk around vehicles for a continuous distance of miles.
Yeah.
And as you might expect, American tactical air power was just absolutely ripping into the Germans on this single route of escape. However, many Germans got away. but we allowed ourselves the euphoria in this great victory to think that maybe, just maybe, the war was going to end within a month or two. And part of that overconfidence is seen within another month when Montgomery launches the ill-fated Operation Market Garden, which, much to everyone's surprise, the Germans are far from dead and were able to contain the airborne carpet that Monty had hoped would lead over the Rhine and into Germany. And so the Germans, they call it the miracle of the fall, because by September and October, the Germans looked like they were on the ropes. But by November, the Germans had pretty much closed the front down. The weather had turned horrible, and the Americans and the British and the Canadians were really, they had to admit they weren't going to get to the Rhine before Christmas. And of course, it turned out they didn't get to the Rhine until March of 45.
Joe, if I could ask this question or bring up this point, ask you to comment on it. The inability to totally close the gap, and we allowed enough Germans to escape to then continue to the war. As I recall the readings, it was the very beginning of the Montgomery versus Patton controversies that then follow through the rest of the war in Northwest Europe. Patton blaming Montgomery for not coming down from the north fast enough. Montgomery blaming Patton for just the opposite, not coming from south to north fast enough. Can you comment on that?
I can comment on it. Because the 29th was not there, I never went into meticulous research on it, but certainly I know of the story. It was, I don't know if the blame can be thrown around as loosely as it was at the time. You hit the nail on the head, Glenn. Patton was commonly blamed other people. And in this case, he may have been right. I mean, the Americans were stopped on the southern shoulder for reasons that are very debatable to this day. And the British and Canadians and Polish, actually, a Polish division, the single Polish division on the front, driving down from the north, was meeting, fanatical resistance, as the Germans were very good at, as you well know. So I would not venture a strong opinion as to who was at fault. I mean, if you want to believe what Patton said, it was Monty who was at fault. But certainly Monty, and I'm not familiar with what he would have spoken up in his defense, but clearly, as General Pickett said at Pickett's charge, why did it fail? He said, well, the Yankees had something to do with it, So, and clearly the Germans had something to do with this.
And I'm not trying to debate which one was at fault, if either was at fault, because it could have been neither. But it clearly was the first major incident between the two, which then began to set up the following controversies that occur as the rest of the campaign in Northwest Europe unfolds between Montgomery, not only Patton, but Montgomery and Bradley and Eisenhower to a large degree as well.
That's a great point. Up until this point, the relations had been pretty good. If you look at Bradley in the Normandy period, he openly served as a subordinate to Monty, and generally things were smooth.
Yeah.
It only, as you said, Glenn, it's in the controversy over how the Germans managed to hang on in the fall, and who was going to get the supplies to lead the final drive into Germany, that it really got bad. And I will venture an opinion on that, and that is that Montgomery showed the worst of his personality at that time, which, as you know, he was a brilliant military leader, and he often brought great victories to the Allied cause, and many American soldiers loved him. The 29th Division soldiers really found Montgomery to be a good man. But he had disdain for some American leaders. He really had thinly veiled disdain for Eisenhower. and equally for Bradley. And it got to the point where if you read some of the intimate letters of not so much Ike, who was, as we know from your last talk with Mr. Paradis, he was tactful enough to try to control himself. But Bradley, in moments where his tongue was loose, he said, "I realized what a petty and small man Monty was, and I never want to serve with him again." And he offered to resign rather than work with him. But that's subject for another story.
Yeah, that's another hour and a half some other time. Let me ask Sean. Sean, I know we've gone way past 8 o'clock. Should we take a brief station break, Sean?
Very brief. We'll do that real quick. Just thanking our sponsor, UPMC for Life. You can check out all the plan options at upmchealthplan.com/medic. Plans created by veterans for veterans that are designed to save you money. Our VJ Day 80th anniversary issue, the summer issue of VBC Magazine, will be going. It's already gone to the printer, so hopefully you guys will be getting it within the next couple of weeks. If you don't receive this magazine, it's because we don't have your address. Please send that to me or Todd or Betty, and we'll make sure to get you on the mailing list. Again, it's a free quarterly magazine. We have a 75th anniversary of the Korean War coming up on Monday. We're hoping to have some Korean War veterans join us for that conversation Monday night. And back here with Glenn Thursday night, PTSD in World War II, The Hidden Legacy, and military contractors, June 30th. If you happen to know any military contractors, please let them know that we are doing a program to honor them and hear their story as we're reaching out, just trying to find more military contractors to come on the program. So please let us know. And then we'll be back in Bethel Park on July 1st for a morning breakfast. Back to you, Glenn.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. You can see, Joe, we're pretty busy.
I can see.
Keep things moving. I've got just two last slides I'd like to show and get your comment on. Obviously, this now shows what happens after Falaise and the move towards Paris. Um, Paris is declared an open city, is right, and it's a French unit that first enters Paris, and finally, as you were talking about those phase lines, I think we sort of catch up with these phase lines somewhere around in here because we advance so quickly from Normandy all the way to Paris.
Yeah, actually, we catch up and exceed the phase lines once we pass the Seine River, which is what you just pointed at with your cursor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I believe Paris, you probably know the famous story that Hitler ordered Paris to be destroyed, but the German commandant said, I better not do that. I don't think I'll get out of this city alive if I do that. And he very wisely surrendered the city. It was a combination of the 2nd French Armored Division under General Leclerc and the 4th U.S. Infantry Division, which also went into Paris. But interestingly, what you're seeing there is the 28th Infantry Division, the old Pennsylvania National Guard unit, which had gotten involved in the close of the Normandy campaign. And during the first phase of the breakout, interestingly enough, its division commander was killed. And so unfortunately for the 29th Division, they took out General Coda, who was the assistant division commander of the 29th, and he was a man that would be sorely missed in the 29th Division, and they put him in command of the 28th, and he led this parade through Paris and on beyond, and then, of course, entered the terrible fighting in the Hurtgen Forest that fall. And sadly for Coda, his career in the 28th was not as positive as it was in the 29th. But
we did a program on the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest last fall at its anniversary and had the division historian of the 28th on tell that story. And boy, talk about a vicious, terrible battle. It's Hurtgen Forest, and
yeah,
so many divisions chewed up for relatively modest gains that yeah. Okay, so that brings to a close the PowerPoint and all that, but I want to come back to allowing our members to ask questions of Joe and his dog, because his dog is also quite
My
quite in.
my dog doesn't leave me alone, and you know, if I sit at the computer for an hour, she's got to get on my lap. So
He's cute. I love the ears. Okay. Excuse my cough. Audience, jump in here. Let's ask a few questions of Joe.
Dave Seaver, I'll ask you to unmute. Colin, I also asked you to unmute. You had a lot of information you put into the chat tonight. Maybe we'd get a bit of the German perspective on a lot of what we talked about tonight. David?
Well, yeah, we're referring to Paris. We're referring to the center of Paris. Albert Speer personally handed a handwritten message from Hitler to Dietrich von Choltitz and told him that Hitler expected him to lay charges to destroy the city. Choltitz said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." Albert Speer left, and he turns to his adjutant, who I interviewed, and said, "There's no way in hell I'm destroying this city. I'll be hung from a lamppost." And another funny thing was when I interviewed General Gavin, he said that when he went to Paris, the first thing he wanted to do was find out where Coco Chanel was, that she had the best dresses, wanted to get one for his wife. But anyway, but it's true, absolutely true. Choltitz did the right thing, the humane thing, and he didn't destroy the city.
right.
Dave Seaver?
So if I recall correctly, being a little bit of an amateur historian, wasn't the original plan to bypass Paris? But the French were so insistent that we actually sent a division in to help them liberate Paris. Is that correct?
Yes, Eisenhower was, with all of the logistical problems that he was facing, the last thing in the world he wanted is responsibility for getting food in for millions of people in Paris. And he thought, well, there's no way in hell we're going to be able to do that. And ultimately, it was a question that would have to be solved. But he said, well, initially said, we'll bypass it. But the Free French troops, particularly the Second Armored Division under Leclerc, were not really going to go for that. And I mean, it's a complex question, but Leclerc got into some difficulty with his American Corps commander, General Giroux, for not really following orders that the Americans wanted him to fulfill, because he saw that the gold, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and Paris was what he would be known for, and he wasn't going to let that go. So, and ultimately, the food issue in Paris in the fall did become somewhat extreme. I mean, people were not starving by any means, but it was, getting food into the city was difficult.
Yeah. I know logistics was an issue all through Europe, with the Red Ball Express. Ironically, when I was in high school, my geometry teacher was a truck driver in the Red Ball Express. And I think I learned more about the Red Ball Express than I did geometry.
We just dedicated a plaque to the Red Ball Express this past June 6th at the National D-Day Memorial. It was a beautiful plaque. Yeah, it's quite a story. It really is.
And I've been to that memorial, and anytime I talk to an audience, highly recommend that you go there. The man behind that memorial, Joe, I know we talked about him a little bit. At least one of the men behind it is Bob Slaughter, and I think you told me you knew Bob Slaughter. You want just briefly, unless there's other questions, give us a 2 or 3 minute background on Bob Slaughter, because he's such a fascinating character.
Bob Slaughter was a member of Company D of the 116th Infantry. He joined in Roanoke, Virginia. It was a heavy weapons company. He joined the company at the age of 15, and yes, that was not it was uncommon, but it was not it was allowed somehow. Unlike today, something like that could not happen today. I knew many people who joined both either the Maryland or Virginia Guard at 14 or 15. Anyway, he landed on D-Day at a few minutes after H hour. Interestingly enough, a 4-year veteran, even though he was only 19 years old.
And
He was a sergeant.
6'4" tall.
Yeah, he was a big guy. I met him in the early 80s, and he had this gleam in his eye. He brought before the board of directors of the 29th Division Veterans Association a plan to have a memorial to D-Day. And, people said, yeah, great idea, but where are we going to get the money? And to cut to the chase, it took about 15 years, but in 2001, the memorial was dedicated. It's been going strong and growing very effectively now for 24 years. People like Charles Schulz, the creator of Peanuts, who was a World War II veteran, became very enamored with the project, gave millions. Anyway, Bob Slaughter was the #1 originator of the plan for that memorial, and I was very, very privileged to have been able to know him before, and then once it was built, he and I would meet there and talk. So it was great to know him. Yeah.
Bob Slaughter is very much like our local well-known Warden Goss, lands on D-Day and fights all the way through the war, I believe, with only one wound during the war, right? One Purple Heart. And at the end of the war, he's comes back home. He's 20 years old and becomes a pressman in Roanoke.
Right.
And, to think about that man's life from 16 to 20 and what he saw and did. He has a memoir, a book, his autobiography that I highly recommend. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I'm sure you do, Joe.
I forget the name, but it just got reprinted. It was out of print for a long time. He was wounded at Veer and came back a couple of months later. And he what he saw and lived through on D-Day was something. I highly recommend his book.
Yeah.
And it talks a lot about the origination of the plan for the D-Day Memorial and why it was put in Bedford. And if you haven't seen it, it's just a fantastic. It's people think of it maybe as just a monument, but it's actually 55 acres of beautifully landscaped grounds, sculptures everywhere, plaques everywhere, tour guides that take you around, artifacts. A tent for lectures. I had a wonderful time when I was there this past June, and also for the 80th, I was there. So it's if you haven't been there, give it a visit.
We just need to build a 4-lane superhighway right up through to Bedford, because it is a little difficult to get to.
Right.
Okay. Anybody else that would like?
One final question here from Jeff Chivers. Joe, could you talk a bit about the friendly fire deaths in the Fillet? Oh, sorry, my chat just jumped. Fillet Gap. How did they happen? Were they typical of strategic bombing close-in support problems in the war?
Yes. Well, #1.
I think it means the St. Lo.
Operation Cobra, yeah, which is really the beginning of how the Falaise Gap forms. But to understand, you have to look to D-Day, actually, because General Bradley, he looked at the problem of invading an enemy-held coast that had been defended for 4 years, and the Germans had strongly entrenched on the coast. And he said, well, our advantage is that we have air power like you cannot believe, that's never been applied in any amphibious assault in history. And so the entire 8th Air Force was dedicated to the task of bombing the beaches just minutes before the first wave troops were to touch down. On Omaha Beach, that task was given to every single B-24 Liberator in the 8th Air Force. It was something like 460 B-24s. And it's a lot of bomb tonnage on 460 B-24s. But I won't get into the complexities of it, but it suffice it to say that it was the worst snafu on D-Day. Not a single bomb from any of those airplanes landed anywhere near Omaha Beach. And you know, there are complex reasons for that, among them the weather, but the main reason is that there was a tremendous fear of inflicting friendly casualties. So they delayed the release of the bombs so significantly that the bombs all went a couple of miles inland. So for Operation Cobra on July 25th, they did the same damn thing. You know, Bradley said, you know, the Germans, they're defending like crazy. They're not yielding an inch, and we have all of this firepower with our heavy bombers, and I think we should apply it on a narrow front and just blast the Germans to smithereens. And again, I won't get into the complexities, but it was an unmitigated disaster. The first day they tried it, they called off the mission at the last second, and too late for several dozen bombers before they dropped their bombs. And, you know, from an altitude of 16,000 feet, it's very hard to tell where the front lines are. And that first day, there was bombing within the American lines, even though we pulled back something like 600 to 800 yards from the forward positions. Nevertheless, they tried it again the next day with the full force of the 8th Air Force. And again, we pulled back several hundred yards from the front line position. We tried to mark the front lines with smoke. General McNair, who was a lieutenant general, and up until that point, well, ultimately he becomes the highest ranking general up to that point, killed in World War II. He wanted to observe the bombing, and he supposedly observed it from a safe point, you know, half a mile behind the front. And unfortunately, they only could identify him by finding his ring finger, and that was all that was left of him. And it killed over 100, I believe it was over 150 American soldiers. Now, that being said, a lot of the bombs did land within German lines, and it did create certainly confusion within the German lines. But given the heavy casualties it caused to friendly troops, it was not an operation you'd want to repeat again. And they tried it once or twice again, and it never really worked. So it was, you know, the death of General McNair, General McNair, if you don't know, was George Marshall's right-hand man. And to have him be killed by friendly fire, not only killed, but obliterated, was a very, very severe loss. He was a very good leader, and he would help make the American army that we know in World War II.
I've read his biographies, and you know, you hear about Marshall being what they called the organizer of the American Army. McNair was sort of the architect and the trainer of the American Army, and his role is much underappreciated because, you know, he spent 99% of his time in DC organizing, right? And he
Yes.
ventures out one time and doesn't make it back. He's quite a fascinating man.
As an aside, he was during the mobilization of the American Army in 1941. You know, prior to Pearl Harbor, he was an ardent enemy of the National Guard. He felt like the National Guard was not ready for modern warfare, and he really wanted it broken up and have the men distributed to active Army units. And I discussed that in my first book on the 29th Division, because McNair just felt like a lot of the leaders, the interwar leaders in the National Guard, were not up to it. And George Marshall had a cooler head. And I don't know if you know this story, but when Douglas MacArthur was chief of staff of the U.S. Army, he kind of sent George Marshall, then a colonel, to Siberia, and it made him he made him advisor to the Illinois National Guard, which was, he thought, a dead end job. And it turned out Marshall really got a feel for the National Guard when he was the advisor to the Illinois Guard. And cooler heads prevailed, and the 29th Division and all other National Guard divisions were pretty much allowed to exist relatively intact as the war began. There were problems, but thanks to Marshall, they fought, as they intended to fight.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've gone beyond our 8:30, which we often do. Sean, unless there's anything significant in the chat or from anybody else, we need to wind this up.
I think we're good.
Okay. Joe, thank you so very, very much for your time and sharing all your knowledge and your clear, passionate storytelling of the 29th Division and the general. We thank you so very much, and we hope you'll become a friend to the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we'll see you again in the future.
I'd love to come back and talk about the division up until the end of the war. So let me know.
Okay, we will do so. Thanks to all the audience, and anybody new, please come back. We appreciate your attendance.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you Monday night for our anniversary of the Korean